This is episode 30 of Soundproofus, and my name is Carrie. Today's episode is truly an East Side, West Side story. We're going to hear from Lucina Chavez-Rosique, a community planner and researcher in New York City. She's collecting data about noise in the Washington Heights neighborhood. We'll talk about the differences between the East Side and the West Side of that neighborhood, which is divided by Broadway and impacted by the Trans-Manhattan Expressway. We'll discuss some of the sources of that noise and how it impacts residents.
My name is Lucina Chavez, and I like to go by Lucina Chavez-Rosique because Rosique is the maternal side of that name, and it's my legal name. So I like to say Lucina Chavez-Rosique. I am a full-time graduate student with CUNY's Baruch campus, which is a business school of CUNY's, but they also have what is known as the Marx School of Public and International Affairs. I came to getting my master's later in my career, and knowing problems were always living in my head. I kept coming up with answers, and I'm thinking, are these even valid? As you point out, you see problems in the world. How do you address them, right? And there are all kinds of recipes to do that. So I worked as a research assistant with the former president of the school for a year. That was a book project that we're doing on social mobility through public higher education. And I've been living in Washington Heights now for the last 10 years. Prior to that, I was in Arizona, in Phoenix for 10 years. As a person that grew up in New York, Arizona was a very weird place to go. But we went, and it was very interesting. As you know, sometimes moves can be. So I'm always surprised to see Phoenix come up as number 2, 3 city, noisiest city in the country.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Interesting. What's the source of the noise in Phoenix?
In Phoenix, well, it comes down to something that happens in New York in the fall, and that's that the humidity goes away and there's no atmosphere to really catch the noise. So there is a big Air Force there. So Thunderbird Air Force is one of the sources of noise. And I've actually been underneath when those jets come out, and it's earth shattering. It's something like you're on another planet. There's a tremendous amount of concrete and traffic and highway in Phoenix. And there's a lot of aviation that's going on. They're I think the friendliest or most efficient airport in the world, but it's nonstop. And so, yes, and it's a transportation hub. There's a lot of traffic. Nobody walks, and there's not a lot of green. There's not enough green. There's not enough earth to absorb any of this noise.
Everybody has their own noise issues, but of course, the one that we're going to talk about today is probably one that's more egregious than most because it's so built into the environment. It's guaranteed to produce noise the way that things are right now, it sounds like.
Yeah, so this study, so this is the capstone for this program. And I decided to do a capstone on the inequities of noise pollution because pretty much everything prior to that, all the other classes kind of, got me here. All of these different avenues of, learning about poverty, learning about green sustainability, economics, statistics, all of that sort of led to this place where I could look at this population divergence that exists here in Washington Heights, look at noise pollution, and really spell out how power affects lives for generations. So, one of the books that we're reading right now is The Power Broker. And
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Good book.
And
long book, but very worth reading.
And it's just, I'm angry at every page. I'm just angry because I'm looking at what he built every day. I'm hearing what he built every day, so those legacies are interesting intersections when it comes down to the socioeconomic divergence that exists here.
We sort of touched on a little bit what made you take an interest in noise as a social and environmental issue, but there must have been some transition from where you went from studying all these different things like poverty to suddenly inspecting the situation in Washington Heights. What made you start to take notice of that community and start measuring it?
Well, so I am a runner. And I trained for several half marathons in this area. And in that training, sometimes you can't look at the same mile every day. So you expand and you go out. And I started noticing just on a sort of day-to-day level how much noisier it was on the east side of Washington Heights versus the west side of Washington Heights. And it's a very obvious visual difference as well, because you can see where half of the population, not half, but, this side of Washington Heights lives completely different. The building structures, the cars that people are driving, the color of their skin, versus going to the east side where it's much, much noisier. And I wanted to know why that was. What was beyond the culture and beyond the need, let's just say, of housing. And obviously there's built structure there that doesn't exist on the west side. There's a 12-lane highway there that goes right through the middle of Washington Heights. So the width of Washington Heights is all of an eighth of a mile. And the George Washington Bridge is on one side, and then the Trans-Manhattan Expressway runs the length of that width and then just spits out onto the Cross Bronx Expressway. That section of Washington Heights is all highway.
On one side of it is the east side. Is it kind of the dividing line between the two?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So Broadway cuts in the middle. So we have there's a famous book actually called Crossing Broadway by a professor at Rutgers University, Professor Snyder. And so this structure has existed from the start, from, the 1920s probably the 1910s, because in the early 20th century, the New York City subway system got a line to come up to northern Manhattan. So people started leaving the southern part of Manhattan, travel north, just for more space, less noise, because New York City was a very, very, very noisy place in 1909. And so it's always been that. So the poorer, more working class immigrants always lived on the east side, which were, Jewish, Greek, Irish, and then the richer German Jewish populations and the more waspy developers lived on the west side. And they developed for themselves. And so that excluded, Eastern European Jewish families from moving in.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know about that. Okay. And so, when I looked into it, I saw that the artery, the Trans-Manhattan Expressway, that actually was completed in somewhere between, I think, 1962 to 1965. So before that, there was some major artery, but nothing like what happened from the 1960s on. It was still like a big boulevard, but nothing like what Robert Moses built. Is that correct?
So Broadway, which runs north-south and is the dividing line that we're talking about, like the socioeconomic dividing line, crosses the Trans-Manhattan Expressway. And so prior to there being the TME, which I have to call it now because I've been saying those three words.
Everybody has an acronym.
Everything has an acronym. Even what we're going to talk about in a minute has an acronym. But yes, so the TME did not exist in any form. So what Robert Moses did was essentially the same thing he did when he created the Cross Bronx Expressway. He demolished buildings, because there were buildings in that hole that is now the Trans-Manhattan Expressway. And the way people left and entered the bridge before that, because there's also 3 other bridges on the other side. So before they had that ability to go onto a highway, Robert Moses had built 2 tunnels that actually enclosed the noise of the cars going back and forth. So it's very interesting. So those tunnels became defunct when they started to rip apart streets and the buildings to make a much, much wider Trans-Manhattan Expressway. So those tunnels are essentially now hidden underneath the structure of the bus depot. So there's a bus terminal, a big bus terminal between the bridge on the street level and then the open Trans-Manhattan Expressway.
So now here you are jogging, you're expanding your jogging path, and now suddenly you're in this very different environment that's, I guess, very noisy, probably very polluted from all the car exhaust, and it's really eye-opening. So from there, how did you make the leap to taking decibel measurements and, really starting to analyze this?
Well, professors are never going to take your word for anything. So I had to prove my argument that there existed a discrepancy based socioeconomically to where noise was going to be more prevalent in these areas versus the wealthier areas. And this is something that we've all experienced, right? You can go to any neighborhood and immediately feel a difference in the atmosphere and the environment when that level of wealth is higher than when you're at a lower, this is everywhere. This is in LA, this is in New York, this is everywhere. Poor areas are just simply noisier areas. And I know that because I have seen neighborhoods around airports, I've seen neighborhoods around freight, I've seen around rail, and wealthy people simply do not live where it's noisy, or they can opt to not live where it's noisy. So they have that option where less wealthy people do not. So, it's funny because even to mask the noise, they built 4 towers above the Trans-Manhattan Expressway. I don't know if you've seen those. There are 4 high-rise towers above the Trans-Manhattan Expressway. 2,000 units, I think, are there. 1,200 units, 2,000 residents live above the Trans-Manhattan Expressway, as if it's not bad enough to live along it. Robert Kennedy visited the tower and said it was like an insult to humanity to have built housing above a highway that busy. So those are called the apartments. So yes, I was always floored by this. I was amazed that people could live near this noise. So I wanted to measure the noise pollution. I got an app and I got one of these things.
Oh, that's good. Okay.
Yeah. So I went around with both just to make sure my app was working. And then I had this to verify it. And so when I would turn it on and I would see the decibels, I could see that, in fact, the app was recording it. And the great thing about the app is that it also has an option for video. So now you're not only capturing the decibel number, you're also capturing the timestamp of the day, the time that you're there, so you can measure day, night, middle, and you can also the source of the noise. So if it's the highway, whether it's plane, helicopter. So then I started measuring noise everywhere. And so my hypothesis was proven that where there are people with a median income of under 60,000 are living in areas where the decibel level increases to up to 40 decibels, which is very dangerous, as you probably know, because, when you count in decibels, you're counting exponentially. You're not counting chronologically. And so I wanted to, put that into a paper and, just develop it and develop the argument.
Now, what about talking to some of the residents? Did you have an opportunity to maybe meet people who lived in some of these zones and get their feelings about it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So everybody, well, everybody complains in New York anyway, but everybody that I spoke to about noise absolutely had something to say. But first, I kind of want to just bring up one interesting thing that happened to me when I was taking noise measurements. So I'm Mexican, and I speak Spanish, and a lot of times Spanish speaking residents will not speak to me in Spanish. It doesn't click to them that I speak Spanish. So what I was hearing as I was walking through that section of Washington Heights was, what is this woman doing? Why is she here? Why is she? Because when you have the phone and you're using the app, it almost looks like, you're filming people, but you're not really filming them, right? I'm not there to, to film you without your permission. I was just sort of taking the noise measurement, but you have to hold the phone and not cover yeah. So you have to walk.
I've just started using one of these apps, actually, by the way. It's called Smarter Noise Pro, and you're absolutely right.
Yeah. And I thought this was much more offensive, but the phone in our culture is probably a lot more offensive.
It is now, yeah.
Yeah. And I didn't, so these are the things that you learn. But yes, so when I was walking around, I wanted to visit kind of like some of the public buildings in our neighborhood that I never went to, which is like the library and schools, churches. And 2 librarians were, I went on a Sunday and they were very generous with their time. And they went on to explain just all of the experiences that they had with noise. One had a mother in a nursing home, and she was explaining how her mom faced a park, and the park during the summer, people would play the music really loud. And even though they would call the police wouldn't do anything. And this was like night after night after night. I was worried about my mother's health. She wouldn't sleep at night. And so, that was one story. And then, another where there's a lot of drag racing along the boulevards here. And so everybody talks about the drag racers, and everybody talks about the cars that have the modified mufflers and just what that feels like. So there was someone that I met through a community board meeting, and he was a law student, and he had started a petition on Avenue, one over from me. And he started this petition to see if he could stop this because, it would be 2 a.m, 3 a.m. I have class the next morning. I can't sleep. And I need to make a case for this. So, he may be making a legal case for, the city or the community board of not doing something here. I mean, just my own story. Last night, I was filming at 2:30 in the morning, garbage trucks that are pulling in, and not just pulling in. One of the guys comes out of the truck and he's instructing the driver, how to pull in, how to back into this business where they have to take the garbage. But this happens every night at 2:30 in the morning.
And they're not talking
And I'm saying,
softly.
oh, no, no, no. It's like something out of a movie. It's like something out of a Scorsese movie. The guys, they were just there Friday night and Thursday night. And I'm thinking, hasn't this guy figured out how to back it in already? He meets this guy every night. And so I go out with I go out with my camera because I'm on the sixth floor and I film them from here because if you zoom in, you can see the company of the garbage company. And so I send it to 311. And so those are the vehicles that are in the neighborhood. But then we also have helicopters that go up and down the Hudson River.
I know about that. Yes, the stop the chop.
Yeah. And that hasn't happened. And one of my slides for my presentation includes the price that they charge per person and all of the slots that they have. So they leave every half an hour, but they have 3 different tours that hit the George Washington Bridge. And so people, they're trying to work the next day. A lot of people work home on the west side of town. So the chop and the airplanes are a very big problem for them. And nobody really from the west side goes to the east side to shop or anything. There's a Target there. There's other supermarkets there, and they won't go because it's just too chaotic. It just comes off as crazy town. So there's a lot of vendors on the street. So there's a very narrow walkway. And when you're walking through the actual storefront and the tabletop storefronts, they're playing unbelievably loud music, tabletop to catch your attention. And it's funny because even the people that set up for like COVID testing and they have their music playing too. So it's just like, you don't even know why you're there or where you are. It just seems like so unproductive.
It's an assault on the senses. Imagine if you lived in one of the apartments near there. You've got that noise coming up from the street all the time and coming through the framing of your building, which, depending on how well the buildings are built there, at least in our wood frame buildings here, it's like an acoustic guitar. It just amplifies inside the building, especially the bass.
And this is very worrisome because, and I'll speak about it in a minute, but based on some survey, I created 2 surveys, one in Spanish and one in English. And then I left an open space at the bottom for people to express anything extra that wasn't covered in the questions. And so I learned a lot about people's experiences that way. But going back to this idea of the apartments being so close, that's really one of the most compelling reasons I did this study is because there are people living in those apartments. There are families there, there are children there. And I just can't imagine what it's like to try and say, watch television on a Saturday or do your homework or, speak on the telephone when so much noise is going out. So yes, some of the information that came in, basically borne that out. And I saw people were saying, I can't work from home without several interruptions during the day, or there's no way for my son to do his homework in the afternoon. And so when it's the entire neighborhood or a majority of the neighborhood, I just think this is an enormous disservice. This is just like another generation that's going to be failed as far as the city goes for not looking at this. So noise measurements that I took from that area average 85 decibels.
That is right. That's OSHA level. Like if you're exposed to that for 8 hours a day, the assumption is it will harm your health at 85, which is already setting the bar pretty high, in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. And luckily, there are some standards that are going lower. So I hope that they're going to have an impact on this argument moving forward, because some of them now are as low as 55, 65 for outdoor noise, 45 for indoor noise. 45 indoor noise is never going to happen.
Yeah. That's 45 is, well, I think a quiet room is about 35. If you just measure a quiet room, I'm sure you've done it. And you just say, what's the average when no one's talking and there's no car revving outside? It's going to be about in that range. But there's a difference in quality between me talking and it's registering as 80 decibels and the sound of mechanical equipment or loud radios outside that are coming into your house and it's 85. And the frequency is really important because if you have low frequency, which is like the bass, those sound waves go through walls and windows more easily than conversation noise does. So you may have 85 decibels, but it's a boom box outside or multiple radios going outside, or 85 decibels because I yelled to you, bring me a cup of coffee. Those two things are very, very different in terms of how you physiologically would react to them, because one is that low frequency disruptive sound and the other is just a momentary human voice.
That's an excellent point. And I personally feel that difference. My birds outside my window chirp at 65, but it's a different 65 than when,
a motorcycle driving 2 blocks away.
Yeah. Exactly. And I anticipate that motorcycle to be 85 in under like 15 seconds. And that's another thing too about Washington Heights that I think makes it an interesting case, is that we're flanked by these two major highways, these major throughways, the FDR and the Henry Hudson. And these are favorite highways for that racer car culture. So you could hear them in Midtown, and they're going to be here in 2 minutes because they're racing at 125 miles and higher up and down these highways. And when they come off the highway, which is about a minute and a half walk from my apartment, once they get to the exit, they have to rev up their engines because I live at the bottom of a hill. So when they go up the hill, like other trucks and other vehicles that have to make it up the hill, they really have to exert that engine. So that noise and that drag of a minute to 2 minutes going up the hill is one of the most painful. It's like the dentist chair. It really is. It's like, stop it.
I totally know. I live in a city full of hills, and we have... Yeah. So yes, I live not far from a major street that is on a hill, and we have drag racing also from these dirt bikes and also these cars with the modified mufflers, and they go up that hill as straight up and straight down. And that sound, when we had the lockdown and there was hardly anyone driving, but the people that did go out were the people that were into racing cars. So we had almost everybody's inside. It's 2:00 in the morning. And we have something here called sideshows where people take over an intersection and then they spin the cars around so it sounds like an accident's about to happen.
Donuts?
Yeah, the donuts. But there's like this constant sound of the tires squealing and then the vrooming. It gets under your skin in a way that is hard to describe, but there is actually probably physiological changes taking place in you when it's 2:00 in the morning and you're trying to sleep and you're hearing this. What sounds like a endless car accident, or like something terrible is going to happen when you hear cars revving like that.
Absolutely. And then I'm thinking about babies because, they haven't fully developed their flight or their
fight or flight.
Yeah, exactly. And so it must feel so threatening. And that's another thing too. I've captured on the decibel reading video, people running across the street with these super fragile carriages, those little flimsy ones that are carrying 30-pound babies inside. And there's a truck honking 91, 92 decibels. And I'm thinking, oh my God, how is this processing into that little brain, into that little body? It has to be so much faster, and setting up this nervous system almost like a suit of armor. But what happened over the years also, because it's adults, yes, and they've tested this with heart rates, blood pressure. A lot of cardiologists, actually, like some of the top cardiologists, one of them is Dr. Fuster. He's a Spanish cardiologist, and he is the number one mentor cardiologist. And he began the American College of Cardiology having now sessions on this. So at their latest conference, they've had a session in the last 2 years, 21 and 22, they had sessions on the impact of noise pollution on cardiovascular diseases. And we all know that. And we've known that for 100 years, actually. It took the medical industry sort of this long to put it out there. And speaking of masters of the captains of industry, these car races are all sponsored by a company called Stellantis. So there's a company called Stellantis, and they're an Italian, French, American merged company. They're a conglomerate, and they own Dodge, Lamborghini. There's another power car. I can't remember it right now. And so because the Dodge Charger is the car of choice for these races because it's so powerful, Dodge sponsors a lot of the rapping. If these kids, because it's all done for social media, they're all videotaping themselves.
Right, I've seen those, but I am shocked that this is sponsored.
Yeah. So you can track this all back. And I think I could send you the link. And I know there's one journalist that's doing it here. I think he's from Streets Blog, and he's following this story. But they sponsor the drivers because then they can do ads for Dodge on the YouTube and Instagram feeds. And another thing that gets sponsored are the tires, because those tires, once they do donuts like that, that tire is done. And these are young, generally Black and brown young men who are part of this car culture that has put like a identity to who they are. And they're not millionaires. These cars start at $50,000. The wrapping for the cars, like that makes it all like pretty and glossy, those are $10,000. So there's a podcast called War on Cars, and they did a 3-part series on this. And so he drives around with these drivers, and he picks them up. It's here in New York. He picks them up. This kid works in a bank by day, not a banker, but he just works as a teller. So he's making, $50,000, $60,000 a year. And he has this car that's worth well over 50,000, but the upkeep is so expensive that he has to do all of this racing and all of these, these spin outs and everything that they call, and post them so he can get the sponsorship for his tires. Gas, he says, is ridiculous because if these cars only do like 15 miles to the gallon. So it's an incredibly expensive, I wouldn't even say sport, hobby, and it's all being sponsored by these car companies.
So you said something very important here, and it really resonated with me, that it's identity, that people are looking for something that makes them stand out, not only generate some income from them because it's a hobby, but also this hobby is their identity. They're not just a bank teller or whatever. And you've got social media and that impact, and you've got companies who are now looking for ways to promote their product through social media. And now all of a sudden you've got something that would be unacceptable before that's being funded by a corporation, being allowed to happen on the streets when, in fact, New York has laws around noise. I thought they were going to be putting more of these streetlight cameras in again to start flagging people for this. What's happening with that?
Well, so we're all waiting. We're all on tenterhooks waiting to see when they're going to get deployed. And funny enough, 8 minutes before I had to get on this podcast, one of my very, very astute neighbors sent me a little piece because she's in with the education unions, and teachers are well aware of the noise that goes around their schools. So they put out this message to say, everyone has to get on 311 and do noise complaints in our zip codes, because otherwise we're not going to get the noise camera where we live, because there's apparently only going to be 5 for the entire city.
Oh, come on.
So
those are easy to avoid. If you have 5 cameras, just don't go down that street.
Correct. And so how they're going to deploy them, I don't know. There doesn't seem to be any organization or communication to the public about how these are going to get deployed by the Department of Environmental Protection. It's been a big fail, I have to say. So the DEP had 3 cameras out in 2021, and they did a pilot program. And based on that pilot program, they're now going to deploy a camera, and it sounds like 1 per borough, or maybe it's 5 per borough. I could always check on that and confirm with you. So there's a law that the state of New York, Governor Hochul passed a law, the sleep law, that would be the enforcement law to these cameras. So now there's an enforcement law that is going to fine drivers with these modified mufflers, but there's no way of incorporating that law or implementing that law because there's no device. So we're still waiting for the devices because police aren't going to stop these guys. I was watching some of these YouTube videos, which are fascinating, by the way. fascinating.
Which ones? You mean the car driver videos, the race car?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
the car driver. Yeah, some of them are so charismatic and so otherwise wonderful kids, right? I mean, one of them is he's shooting himself coming in from New Jersey over the GWB, George Washington Bridge, and he's gotten stopped at Fort Lee before getting into New York, right? Which is the New Jersey side of the bridge. And the cop is completely in love with his car. He's like, where did you get this? How much did you pay for it? And he's like, it starts at 50,000 and da da da. And he's explaining to him, he's like, you're a YouTube star? And he's like, yeah. What happened was that he didn't have legal plates. And it's another problem. I'm not completely convinced that these noise cameras are going to be as effective as they deem to be, because half of these cars don't have legal plates, or maybe all these cars don't have legal plates. Most of these cars.
Do they have plates at all? And also there are these covers now that they can
Yes.
put on the plate so you can't see what the numbers are on it.
Yes, that's another. I mean, and these, especially here in Washington Heights, after I read some of the comments from my survey, one of them really just disturbed me a great deal. Somebody wrote in the survey comment area that the police in Washington Heights don't do anything about enforcing this because they're in it. Verbatim, they were saying these cops drink, hang out, and listen to loud music with these drivers. Why would they stop them? They're part of the same group. And I'm sure you've heard about the placard abuse that happens here in New York. So, cops here they can park in your living room.
Right, right. Well, bike lanes are like, forget about
Right,
it.
right, right. Yes, exactly. They'll park anywhere with impunity because they have these placards. And so another thing I filmed was just for fun, I filmed all of the cars that are at the 34th precinct, which is a precinct here in North Washington Heights. And the way that they're parked in front of businesses, they're practically at the business door, right? So if you open the door to go into the restaurant, you're almost butting up to the car on the sidewalk. So, and I think that's one of the favorite parts for these guys to race, because I've seen them. I go to the Staples there. I'm like walking, and there are gangs and gangs and gangs of like mopeds and dirt bikes that go right past the precinct. Nothing.
We have that here too. I mean, it's as if the whole of the United States has given up on just the basic things that we took for granted that would be rules enforced and general common courtesy to other people and everything. It's sort of like all of that simultaneously is kind of ending, not just in New York. It's, here in San Francisco, probably in many cities, of just like basic laws that for a while were just common wisdom. Like you just don't blast a stereo in the middle of the night, with a huge bass system on it while people are trying to sleep, or you don't drive 120 miles an hour in the middle of Manhattan, and these things are happening now. And why? Why is it happening so much everywhere? And it's not just here. I mean, when we talked to Samara Abdulali about the noise in Mumbai, same thing. It was super hard. You've got a culture where everybody honks as a form of talking, honks the tuk-tuk or whatever, and trying to do something about that, but everybody's in on it, They hate it. Kind of like you have to have the will to change.
And I mean, there's so many things that pop into my head as you're saying this, because so many of these features have dichotomies. So I came across noise pollution studies that showed that Germany had amongst the highest violence rate due to noise pollution. So just the night after night after night of losing sleep has caused quite a bit of violence in Germany. And so scientists looked into this just to make a connection between the noise pollution and the acts of violence that can occur due to loss of sleep and impact on the nervous system. And this idea of honking with people, in Mumbai, that happens here on the corner. It seems to be something that in the Dominican Republic is very common. So we have livery cabs, in other words, not Uber, not Yellow, private cars, and they're always honking with each other. And I'm thinking, okay, that's superfluous because we really don't need another form of honking. I mean, we have enough. And that actually goes back to in the early 1900s when New York City had its very, very first league against noise, headed by she was a physician, but she was also married to a very wealthy publisher at the time. And her thing was the tugboat tooting that was happening on the Hudson because she had a mansion on Riverside. And she said, how are the patients in the hospital going to get well if the tugboats don't stop? So it's this thing about noise. And I think some of it, yes, has to do with social norms, because going back to the original question is what compelled me to go out there and measure noise, is that because one neighborhood was so much quieter than the other. And it has to do a lot with those social norms. There just isn't the level of noise from people or from their behavior on the west side of Washington Heights compared to the east side, where it's more permissible, it's cultural. It's almost like, why aren't you making noise? We don't understand. Why are you so quiet? You're not normal to us anyway. But to me, it keeps going back to power. And these young men don't have power. They don't have any social power, right? Because they're like, we had been discussing, they need this identity to give them some power. The companies that are propagating noise are in enormous positions of power because they're essentially the oil companies, fossil fuels, building, airlines, who are kind of puppeteering the power because legislation should already be in place. I mean, noise pollution has been talked about before air pollution, before water pollution. Air and water came afterwards, right? And noise pollution in New York City has been something that's been in the ether since the Industrial Revolution, and we haven't stopped it. I don't know enforcement-wise, because now a lot of advocates are coming against these noise cameras because they feel they're going to be implemented in areas where more drivers of color are going to be caught driving through there without really going through the process. So, that's another thing that now may halt the deployment of these cameras.
But I also feel like that's also saying, like, well, if you're from this culture or if you're this ethnicity, you like noise, even at night when you're trying to sleep. So to try to eliminate noise at 1 o'clock in the morning, you're depriving people from a particular ethnic group of their lifestyle. Well, no, I don't believe that. I don't believe that anyone wants to be kept awake by the sound of throttling car engines coming through their walls when they're trying to sleep. I really don't think so. But at the same time, if you don't set some parameters, like find a racetrack for them to go to, don't use city streets, find an area where they can go. Now, there's always going to be people who say, well, I don't want to go to the place that the city set up for me. But you're not going to be able to stop young men's interest in cars or even police, it sounds like. So you have to figure something else out that doesn't just seem like you're trying to take away people's identity and their fun. At the same time, respecting other people. Same thing with these, what you talk about, these tabletop vendors. We have that here too. If everybody's blasting a radio, like, what do you do about that? It seems like you're going to have one group that says, but people like the music and it adds liveliness. But at the same time, you might have 100 people living in apartment buildings right around there who would actually really like for those radios to be turned down. How do you get compliance and how do you enforce something if you pass a law? A lot of people hate the police. What do you do now? Now do you try to add extra layers to the buildings so that the noise doesn't come through? And what are you going to do?
And it's funny because part of the project is to come up with a viable solution that doesn't make it like you're trying to save the world, right? So what is this community-based solution? And the professor had injected ideas to where, you would put actual physical traffic abatement sort of things like into the concrete, sort of like these rumble strips or something like that, where the car jumps. But then I thought that creates a new noise problem, because how are you going to get an 18-wheeler over a rumble strip going up a hill? That's not going to be any fun to anyone. And so I tried to get the Department of Transportation to put in at least one no honking sign. And they sent me back a reply, automated, of course, saying that there's no need for a no honking sign because there's already a law in place, which I wanted. If I had the means, I would have blown that response up and put it on a billboard, because I want everyone to laugh with me about this is the response that the DOT sends. There's no need for a no honking sign because there's already a law in place. Okay, great. And then I asked for a noise camera, and it just says that they're looking into it, right? So my little bubble on the map of my request says, looking into it. And I know that top down is not going to be the answer only. It can't. So bottom up, for me, was my option. And what I chose was, I found a company actually an organization, and I think they're out of Mumbai. What they do is that they have residents take these things, right? And they go around and they measure the noise in their backyard. And then together they build a map. They build a noise map. And so that is going to be my problem solver for this project. And it's going to be 16, 18 individuals from each side, wealthy side, not wealthy side, that will come together with findings, feed it into a map, kind of like an ArcGIS thing, and use that map as a tool to then do advocacy work and then present this to, as an argument, as a public argument, either at the community board level, at the city level, wherever. And then hopefully encourage other neighborhoods to do the same so that the people that are living in those areas are sort of becoming aware of it as they're becoming aware of it. They don't need me to tell them what it is. They don't need Department of Transportation to tell them what it is. And here you go. And then support all of that with how those findings then connect to their health, their particular health. Because one thing we do know is that disadvantaged communities have high propensity already for all of those public health issues that noise negatively impacts. It's like, do you want more cardiac arrests in your family? Do you want diabetes to be exacerbated further? Do you want your child to lose another year of schooling because of noise? It's a long shot, right? Because it's the most powerless population, maybe not the most, but in terms of adults, to speak up against this terrible imbalance of power. But it's one way. So, we'll see.
I think it's a great idea. I think the data, you could almost guess what the data might be already. The people that will participate probably are the ones who are quietly bothered by noise, but don't want to be the one who sticks their neck out.
Oh, and this is absolutely something that will take different populations. So it's not just like an adult, like it won't be just folks like you and I. It will be grade school with a parent, high school with on their way wanting to go to college, just because another piece of this, as you were pointing out earlier about civility, is the civic engagement component, right? It's this idea of like, how much of this can you connect to your leadership and to your democracy? Like, is it really just something that you throw up your hands up in the air and just say, okay, whatever. It's the car companies, it's the airplane companies, but we can't do anything about it. So why bother? And that could be on any side. You could make $1 million a year and think that way as much as making $10,000 a year and think that way.
Right.
I think the most important thing that we all should know, and that this project has taught me, is don't give up. Just keep fighting for noise pollution. Keep fighting for the fact that, individuals do have a voice. And it's very important to listen to the Arlene Bronzapps of the world, because they have been doing this now for decades. There are organizations that people could go to and look to get answers about noise pollution. Quiet Communities is now suing the EPA for inaction, which is, I think, an incredible step. I know, it's unbelievable. So that brings us to a place of hope.
Yeah.
I think education, and don't keep quiet about noise. I mean, make noise about noise.
I'd like to thank Lucina Chavez-Rosique for sharing her story with us, and I look forward to hearing the results of her community research and proposed solutions. Thanks for listening, everyone, and to learn more about noise, acoustics, and soundproofing, visit soundproofist.com.